The men who found the shelter in 1968 swore they smelled iron before they saw anything at all, a sharp, blood-like tang carried on the cold Appalachian wind. The mountains were quiet that morning, too quiet for February, as if the forest itself had learned the discipline of holding its breath. What they uncovered beneath a collapsed ridge of stone and roots looked less like a home and more like a wound cut into the earth, a low door reinforced with scavenged boards, rusted hinges, and symbols scratched so deeply into the wood they could still be felt with gloved fingers. Inside, the air was warmer than it should have been, stale and thick with years of candle smoke and damp wool. 3 narrow beds lined the far wall, each neatly made, each untouched by dust. Shoes sat beneath them, arranged by size, as though their owners had stepped out only moments before. On a crate near the center of the room rested a tape recorder, its red light dark but intact, surrounded by dozens of reels wrapped in oilcloth and string. Every label bore the same last name, Boone. At first, investigators believed the shelter belonged to survivalists or moonshiners, another forgotten pocket of Appalachian secrecy. That assumption died the moment they played the first tape. A child's voice filled the room, calm but trembling, counting seconds between distant sounds that echoed like footsteps through trees. The voice spoke of rules, when to speak, when to whisper, when not to breathe at all. Another voice joined in, older, warning that the mountain could hear them if they weren't careful. As the tapes progressed, the recordings became stranger. The siblings spoke directly to the darkness beyond the shelter walls, apologizing, bargaining, sometimes crying. On certain reels, long stretches of silence were broken by a sound like slow breathing that did not match any human rhythm. One voice, softer than the rest, appeared without introduction and never identified itself, yet the others responded to it with fear and obedience. Those who listened too long reported headaches, nosebleeds, and the unsettling sense of being watched from behind, even in locked rooms miles away from the mountains. By the time officials realized the Boone siblings had vanished decades earlier under unexplained circumstances, it was already too late. The tapes had been copied, studied, replayed, and in doing so, something buried since childhood had been invited to listen again. In the winter of 1968, the Appalachian Mountains pressed down under an early frost that arrived without warning and refused to leave. A state forestry crew had been sent into the higher ridges to investigate repeated reports of radio interference that had begun disrupting emergency frequencies used by nearby counties. The static did not behave like normal signal drift. It came in pulses, rising and falling at the same hours each night, as if something were deliberately answering calls that no one had made. Radios crackled even when powered off, and one ranger swore he heard a child's voice whispering beneath the hiss, counting slowly before the signal collapsed into silence. The crew followed the interference deeper into terrain that locals avoided, a stretch of mountain where trees grew twisted and sparse, their roots clawing through stone as though the ground itself had tried to reject them. Snow lay thin but uneven, melted in strange circular patches that suggested heat beneath the surface. The air smelled wrong there, metallic and sharp, like old pennies rubbed together, and even seasoned woodsmen found themselves checking over their shoulders for reasons they could not explain. Compasses spun uselessly, forcing the men to navigate by memory and instinct alone. It was near a narrow ravine that the radios suddenly went dead all at once, replaced by an unnatural quiet so complete it rang in the ears. One of the men slipped on loose shale and struck what sounded like hollow wood instead of rock. Clearing away dirt and dead leaves revealed a crude structure buried into the hillside, reinforced with logs blackened by age and weather. The door was almost invisible, masked by moss and bark, but symbols had been carved into it with obsessive repetition, deep grooves worn smooth by time and touch. For several minutes no one spoke. The forest around them seemed to recoil, branches creaking though there was no wind, birds absent from the trees. When the door was finally forced open, a rush of warm air escaped, carrying the scent of smoke, sweat, and something older that none of them could name. The temperature difference was enough to fog their breath, as if the mountain itself had been exhaling. Inside, the shelter showed signs of careful, prolonged habitation rather than abandonment. Ashes in the fire pit were layered, not cold, and a kettle sat suspended above it, dry but recently cleaned. Scratches marked the walls at measured intervals, notches counting days or weeks or something else entirely. Near the back, stacked against a crate, were dozens of reel-to-reel tapes wrapped in oilcloth, each one labeled in precise handwriting that looked too deliberate for children yet was unmistakably youthful. As one ranger reached out to touch them, his radio flared back to life without warning, emitting a burst of static so loud it dropped him to one knee, and beneath it, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of breathing that did not belong to anyone standing in that room. Once the initial shock of discovery wore thin, the men began to take inventory of what the shelter contained, expecting to find signs of brief refuge or emergency use. Instead, everything suggested endurance. The beds were not makeshift piles of leaves or blankets but narrow wooden frames smoothed by years of use, their joints reinforced with careful craftsmanship. Each was paired with personal belongings arranged with quiet intention, a folded coat mended at the elbows, a chipped enamel cup, a child's pocketknife sharpened down to almost nothing. Nothing felt discarded. Nothing felt forgotten. What unsettled the investigators most was the rhythm of life preserved in the space. The walls bore pencil markings tracking seasons rather than days, tallying winters survived and springs endured. A small shelf held jars of dried roots and berries, each tagged with notes written in a child's uneven hand, warnings about dosage and timing. It became clear that whoever lived here had not simply hidden from the world but had built a system to outlast it. The shelter was not a panic response, it was a decision made long ago and upheld with discipline. As names began to appear in notebooks recovered from a sealed tin, the truth surfaced slowly, almost reluctantly. The handwriting matched school records from a nearby hollow, files pulled from county archives after the discovery. The Boone siblings had vanished in the early 1940s, 3 children reported lost during a sudden flood that swept through their family's property. Search parties had combed the riverbanks for weeks, finding nothing. The case was closed, folded into the long list of Appalachian disappearances that never earned headlines or memorials. Yet here was proof not only of survival, but of decades spent in isolation. Heights marked along one beam showed children growing into adolescence and then stopping, the lines ending abruptly as if growth itself had become dangerous. Clothing sizes plateaued, repaired again and again rather than replaced. A journal entry described rationing 4 long quiet months, suggesting they remained hidden even when food was scarce and illness lingered. The siblings spoke of the outside world as something that had moved on without them, something that could no longer be safely re-entered. There were no photographs of parents, no mention of rescue, only fragmented references to a promise broken and a warning ignored. One passage described the night they came to the shelter as a return rather than an escape, implying the structure had existed before the disaster that supposedly killed them. The children wrote of being declared dead with a strange mixture of fear and relief, recognizing that the world's belief in their absence was the only thing keeping them safe. Investigators began to understand that the Boone siblings had lived their entire formative lives beneath the mountain, listening to distant human activity like ghosts haunting their own childhood. They had learned to measure time by sound rather than sight, counting passing trucks, seasonal hunters, and the rare echo of voices drifting through the trees. The shelter was not a temporary hiding place but a sealed chapter of human life written parallel to history, sustained by necessity and something closer to obedience than fear. The tapes were discovered stacked with reverent care, as though they were the most valuable objects in the shelter. Each reel was wrapped in oilcloth, tied with twine, and arranged in chronological order inside a wooden crate lined with fabric cut from old shirts. The recorder itself sat nearby, cleaned and maintained far beyond what anyone expected from children living in isolation. Its casing bore scratches from repeated handling, but the inner mechanisms were immaculate, oiled and protected from damp, suggesting someone had learned to preserve it as a lifeline rather than a luxury. Every reel was labeled in neat, deliberate handwriting that shifted subtly over time. Early dates were written in large, uncertain letters, while later ones tightened into careful script. Alongside the dates were notes such as listening hours, warning night, and do not replay alone. Some reels carried a single word written heavier than the rest, as if pressed into the paper with fear, answered, too close, or simply heard. None of the labels explained what was being recorded, only that the act itself was necessary. When the first tape was played, the room seemed to contract around the listeners. The sound quality was clear enough to capture breathing, fabric movement, and distant environmental noise that did not match the forest outside. The voices belonged to children at different ages, sometimes overlapping, sometimes whispering as if volume itself carried risk. They spoke in measured phrases, repeating rules and recounting events with a ritualistic calm that felt rehearsed rather than spontaneous. It was immediately clear the recordings were not meant for entertainment or memory but for documentation. As more reels were reviewed, patterns emerged. The siblings used the recorder to log disturbances in the mountain, noting times, durations, and changes in sound. Footsteps were described without ever naming a source. Knocks were counted rather than questioned. Silence was treated as an event worthy of recording, with entire reels devoted to nothing but the absence of noise, punctuated by whispered confirmations that the tape was still running. On some recordings, the children addressed the machine directly, speaking as though it were a witness rather than a tool. The most unsettling detail lay in the voices that did not belong. On several tapes, after long stretches of careful narration, another sound appeared, low and indistinct, responding to the children in tones too distorted to identify as human. The siblings never expressed surprise when this happened. Instead, they adjusted their behavior, lowering their voices further, apologizing, or promising compliance. One child could be heard reminding the others that the recorder needed to be on so it would know we remembered. Investigators noted that the tapes grew more frequent during certain months, clustering around late winter and early fall, while other periods were almost entirely unrecorded. It suggested cycles, as if whatever the siblings were documenting came and went on a schedule they had learned to anticipate. By the final reels, the children no longer introduced themselves or explained context, speaking with the weary familiarity of people long accustomed to being heard by something unseen. The tapes were not messages meant to be found but records of a conversation that had been ongoing for years, preserved not for history, but for survival. The earliest tapes were the hardest to listen to, not because they contained the most frightening sounds, but because they carried the raw confusion of children trying to explain terror without language for it. The voices were younger then, uncertain and frequently interrupted by whispered arguments over what could safely be said out loud. They spoke of their home in fragments, never describing it fully, only referring to it as a place where the walls had begun to listen back and the nights no longer stayed quiet even when everyone was awake. Their fear did not stem from a single event but from a slow realization that something had changed and that the adults around them refused to name it. On one tape, the oldest sibling described going to their parents with questions after hearing footsteps inside the house long after everyone had gone to bed. The response, captured in the child's careful retelling, was dismissal wrapped in forced calm. They were told it was the mountain settling, the wind finding cracks, imagination fed by too many stories. Yet the child's voice trembled as they repeated a warning their mother had given in the same breath, telling them not to answer if they heard their names being called at night. The contradiction hung heavy in the recording, the first indication that the adults knew more than they admitted. As the tapes continued, the siblings recounted small, accumulating signs that the house was no longer safe. Shadows lingered in doorways after lights were lit. The floorboards near the back room creaked in patterns that did not match footsteps. One child spoke of feeling watched from beneath the floor, not above it, as if the ground itself had gained awareness. Each time they brought these concerns to their parents, they were met with silence or anger, reminders of faith, of tradition, of not inviting trouble by speaking of it. The decision to flee did not come in a moment of panic but in quiet agreement. The children recorded themselves whispering about the shelter as though it were already familiar, a place spoken of in warnings and half-told stories. They described being taught where it was without being told why, instructed only that if the mountain ever stopped sounding like itself, they were to go there and stay. The night they left, they did not pack toys or keepsakes, only tools, blankets, and the tape recorder, which one sibling insisted was necessary so they could prove it wasn't our fault. What haunted investigators was the way the children spoke of their parents afterward. There was no anger, only sorrow and a lingering hope that the adults would eventually understand. They waited for days, then weeks, listening for familiar voices calling them home. When those voices never came, replaced instead by sounds they refused to describe, the siblings stopped waiting. In one early recording, a child stated with fragile certainty that their parents had chosen not to listen, and because of that, the house had learned their voices better than their children ever could. As the years passed on the tapes, The shelter ceased to be described as a hiding place and became something far more deliberate. The siblings began to speak of it as a line drawn in the mountain, a place where certain sounds stopped and others were no longer allowed to cross. Early on, they tested this boundary without fully understanding it, stepping just outside the entrance and recording the way the forest sounded different depending on how far they went. At specific distances, the birdsong thinned, the wind dropped away, and the air felt heavier, as if pressing back against their ears. These moments were logged carefully, not with curiosity, but with the seriousness of people learning rules that could not be broken. The tapes reveal that the shelter had been built with intent long before the children ever used it. Certain boards were etched with symbols repeated on the door, marks that aligned precisely with cracks in the rock face behind the walls. One sibling explained that they were told never to alter those carvings, no matter how damaged the wood became, because they were how the mountain knows where to stop. The shelter's placement was exact, nestled into a natural fault where sound behaved strangely, echoing inward rather than outward. The children learned quickly that noise made inside did not travel beyond a certain point, as if absorbed by the stone itself. Over time, the recordings shifted from fear-driven observations to methodical documentation. The siblings discussed how long the boundary held during storms, whether heavy rain weakened it, and what happened when snow piled too high against the entrance. On one tape, a child described hearing something approach from the woods, its presence marked not by sound but by the sudden absence of everything else. They waited in silence, recording the moment the pressure in the air increased, then eased, noting with relief that it never crossed into the shelter. More unsettling were the moments when the boundary worked in the opposite direction. Some recordings captured knocking or scratching from within the mountain itself, sounds that seemed to originate behind the walls rather than outside them. The siblings responded by reciting phrases they had been taught, words spoken evenly and without emotion, meant to remind whatever listened that it was contained. These rituals were never explained, only practiced, as if explanation itself carried risk. The shelter became a place of constant vigilance rather than comfort. Sleep was taken in shifts, with one child always listening, recorder running, finger hovering over the stop button in case silence became too complete. They learned that absolute quiet was more dangerous than noise, because it meant the boundary was being tested. When questioned on tape why they stayed instead of leaving the mountains entirely, the answer was simple and repeated across years: the shelter was the only place where the rules were clear. By the later recordings, the siblings no longer spoke of escape or rescue. The shelter was described as an anchor, a necessary weight holding something in place. One voice stated plainly that leaving would not remove the problem, only move it, and that the mountain had chosen its edges carefully. The shelter was not meant to save them, but to ensure that whatever listened beyond its walls remained where it had always been, pressed back into the dark by wood, stone, and the unbroken act of being heard. The first time the unfamiliar voice appeared on the tapes, it did so without announcement or disruption, slipping into the recording as though it had always been there. The siblings were cataloging a night of heightened activity outside the shelter, noting distant movements and the way the wind refused to settle. One child was mid-sentence when a low sound emerged beneath their words, not loud enough to interrupt but distinct enough to change the rhythm of their breathing. The recorder captured it clearly, a tone shaped like speech but stripped of warmth, as if language itself were being approximated rather than spoken. What followed was not panic, but recognition. The children fell silent almost immediately, listening with the practiced stillness they had developed over years. When they finally spoke again, it was not to question the voice but to answer it. Their responses were brief, careful, and deferential, as though addressing something that required respect rather than understanding. One sibling apologized for speaking out of turn. Another reminded the others that the boundary still held. The voice responded with a sound that rose and fell, mimicking the cadence of agreement. On subsequent tapes, the presence became more defined. It never introduced itself, never named the children, yet it responded when spoken to, choosing moments of fatigue or emotional strain to emerge. Sometimes it echoed the last word a child said, stretching the sound until it lost its original meaning. Other times it filled the silence between sentences with a faint, rhythmic noise that resembled breathing but lacked the irregularity of a living body. The siblings adapted quickly, altering their speech patterns, shortening sentences, and avoiding certain words altogether. Most disturbing was the implication that the voice was not external. In several recordings, the children described hearing it when no sounds came from outside the shelter, when the forest had gone inert and the boundary felt strongest. One child whispered that it was closer on those nights, not in distance but in attention. They debated, in hushed tones, whether the voice was something that had followed them from the house or something awakened by the act of recording itself. The recorder was never turned off during these discussions. As months passed, the voice grew bolder. It began to anticipate responses, pausing as though waiting for acknowledgement before continuing. On one tape, a child hesitated too long before answering, and the voice repeated itself with greater force, causing the youngest sibling to cry. The others soothed them, reminding each other that compliance kept the boundary intact. They spoke of the voice as one might speak of weather, something dangerous but manageable if respected. There were moments of quiet resistance. A later recording captured a child asking the voice what it wanted, a question met with prolonged silence that stretched until the tape ran out. The next reel began with the siblings reciting their rules in unison, their voices strained but steady, as if reaffirming an agreement that had been nearly broken. The existence of the voice transformed the shelter from a defensive space into a place of negotiation, where survival depended not only on staying hidden, but on maintaining a fragile dialogue with something that had learned how to listen back from the dark beyond the walls. The effects of the tapes on those who listened to them were not immediate, which made them easier to dismiss at first. Investigators, archivists, and audio technicians reported only mild discomfort during initial reviews, headaches blamed on old equipment or long hours in poorly ventilated rooms. It was only after repeated exposure that patterns emerged, subtle enough to avoid alarm but consistent enough to unsettle those comparing notes. The same dreams were described independently by people who had never met, each recalling long corridors of wood and stone, lit by flickering light that never revealed its source. Sleep became irregular. Listeners reported waking at precise times, usually just before dawn, with the sensation of having been spoken to rather than awakened. Some claimed they could still hear the low hum of tape reels spinning long after leaving the archive rooms, a phantom sound that followed them into cars, bedrooms, and public spaces. Audio specialists noted a lingering pressure in the ears, as if descending from altitude, accompanied by moments of distorted hearing where everyday sounds seemed delayed by a fraction of a second. More troubling were the changes in perception. Several individuals described becoming acutely aware of silence, not as an absence of sound but as a presence that felt deliberate. Rooms that were normally quiet began to feel crowded, their stillness heavy and expectant. One archivist confessed to whispering without realizing it, convinced that speaking at normal volume in her own home felt inappropriate. Another reported compulsively counting seconds between noises, mimicking the behavior recorded on the tapes without conscious intent. Medical evaluations revealed nothing conclusive. Nosebleeds, migraines, and elevated stress markers were recorded, but no shared physiological cause could be identified. Psychologists suggested suggestion and emotional contagion, yet these explanations failed to account for the precision of the experiences. Multiple listeners, separated by time and geography, described the same auditory distortion, a soft undertone beneath recorded speech that became more noticeable the longer they listened, as if the tapes were teaching the ear how to hear it. The most alarming incidents occurred during group listening sessions. On more than one occasion, playback equipment malfunctioned simultaneously, spools slowing or stopping without mechanical cause. In one instance, a reel resumed playing on its own after being removed from the recorder, emitting a brief burst of sound that matched no recorded segment. Witnesses described feeling watched during these events, not from any visible source but from within the sound itself, as though attention could travel through recorded audio. As word spread, access to the tapes was restricted, though not before several copies had been made for study. Those who had spent the most time listening reported a lingering sense of connection, an impression that the recordings were incomplete without an audience. One investigator admitted to feeling guilty when he stopped playback, as if ending a conversation prematurely. The tapes did not simply document the Boone siblings' experience, they appeared to extend it, reproducing the conditions of vigilance and unease in anyone who listened long enough, drawing them into the same careful, listening state that had once kept 3 children alive beneath the mountain. Among the most unsettling revelations within the tapes was the presence of a voice that the siblings themselves never acknowledged as real, yet spoke more than any of them. On certain reels, the oldest sibling's voice would pause mid-sentence, and the recorder would capture a reply in a tone unlike any human timbre. It was lighter than the children's, softer, almost whisper-like, but precise, carrying a weight of knowledge and authority that none of them ever challenged. At first, listeners assumed it belonged to an adult hiding nearby, or perhaps a sibling too shy to speak openly. But as the recordings progressed, inconsistencies emerged. The voice responded when no one else was present, addressed events that happened long before the recording, and occasionally contradicted the siblings' own statements. The recordings suggested a strange coexistence. The siblings treated this unseen presence as part of their daily reality. They spoke to it routinely, asking permission, apologizing, even negotiating. One tape caught a moment where a sibling whispered that they had forgotten to perform a nightly ritual, and the unseen voice scolded them in reply. The tone was not cruel, yet it conveyed authority that overrode fear, compelling obedience. The children's responses were careful, measured, and habitual, as though their survival depended not only on remaining hidden but on maintaining a precise relationship with this entity. Listeners began to notice that the tapes often shifted abruptly when this voice appeared. Background noises would vanish, replaced by near-perfect silence, and the siblings' speech would slow, punctuated by long pauses, as if listening intently to a presence that could not be ignored. The voice rarely initiated contact but would intervene at the slightest deviation from protocol or expectation. In one chilling instance, a sibling attempts to correct a previous statement, and the voice repeats the original, unaltered, as if affirming a memory that must remain intact. Later recordings suggest that the voice's existence had a temporal dislocation. It occasionally referenced events the children could not have experienced, yet did so in intimate detail, correcting their understanding without revealing its origin. The siblings did not question these contradictions, implying either absolute trust or learned compliance. On some tapes, the voice anticipates their words, replying before they are spoken, which unsettled investigators who played the recordings, realizing that its timing defied conventional human interaction. By the final reels, the voice had become the dominant presence, more audible and insistent than any of the siblings. Its authority reshaped the recordings into something resembling a dialogue between three children and an entity that existed outside their understanding of reality. The tapes hinted that one of the siblings may have been a vessel for the voice, channeling it through habitual speech, or that the voice itself had never been human at all. Whatever the truth, it became clear that the Boone shelter was not simply a refuge, it was a controlled environment, maintained by the siblings under constant supervision of something that listened, corrected, and persisted beyond the bounds of ordinary childhood, shaping every word they spoke and every action they took. As the tapes were archived and catalogued, the disappearance of a single reel went unnoticed at first, a small slip in a vast collection that seemed orderly and complete. Months later, it resurfaced under mysterious circumstances, no longer wrapped in oilcloth but stored on modern magnetic tape, its sound quality inexplicably sharper and clearer than the originals. Whoever had transferred it left no notes, no indication of who had handled the recording or why, and the reel's content was immediately disquieting. Unlike the others, which documented the children's disciplined routines and cautious speech, this tape seemed to move with intent, as if the voices knew they were being listened to outside the shelter for the first time in decades. The recording began with silence, a measured pause, and then the siblings spoke directly to the audience, acknowledging that someone had found them. Their words were careful, polite, but layered with tension, as though they were testing the boundaries of the listener's attention. They referred to rules that no one had ever explained in prior tapes: how to respond, how to behave, how to ensure the voice beyond the walls remained contained. There were moments where the unknown voice also appeared, faint but unmistakable, speaking in rhythms that anticipated the children's replies. It did not offer guidance this time, it observed, measured, and corrected. What unsettled listeners most was the way the siblings referenced knowledge of the modern world, despite living in isolation for decades. They spoke of technologies they could not have seen, of events they could not have witnessed firsthand, all described through a careful filter of speculation and observation. This temporal dissonance gave the impression that the shelter had not merely preserved them but had somehow extended their awareness, bridging decades and environments in a way that defied logic. Listeners reported immediate physiological reactions similar to those induced by the original tape's headaches, ringing in the ears, and a strange sensation of being watched, but intensified, as if the voices were aware of their presence and deliberately reaching through the recording. The siblings' tone, though consistent with prior recordings, carried an urgency absent before, a subtle insistence that rules be remembered and followed precisely. On multiple occasions, the tape seemed to pause mid-sentence, leaving silence that pressed against the listener's attention, then resumed with a slightly altered cadence, as though testing the audience's patience and obedience. Experts who studied the reel noted that it did not exist within the same temporal framework as the other recordings. The voice's cadence and phrasing suggested an ability to interact with events beyond the moment of recording, blurring the line between past and present. By the time the tape ended, the audience was left with the unnerving certainty that the Boone siblings and whatever supervised them had not been confined to their shelter for decades as previously believed. Instead, the shelter had acted as a medium, and the voices, now unmoored from time, could reach beyond the mountain, observing and interacting with anyone who dared to listen. By the time the last of the tapes had been studied, a chilling realization had begun to settle over those who had listened: the Boone shelter was never truly abandoned. Every recording, every detail preserved on fragile reels, pointed toward continuity rather than conclusion. The siblings' routines, meticulously documented over decades, had not ended with the discovery of the shelter. They had continued in some form, maintained either by habit, necessity, or the unseen presence that guided them from the shadows. It became apparent that the mountain itself had not relinquished its secrets, and whatever had been contained within the shelter was still present, still attentive. Investigators noted anomalies in the shelter's condition that could not be explained by natural decay. Dust lay undisturbed in places where even the lightest draft would have scattered it. The fire pit bore traces of recent use, ash lightly blackened, suggesting candles or embers had been tended not long before discovery. Food stores, though aged, showed signs of selective handling, as if someone had monitored their inventory, removing and replacing items in deliberate patterns. Every object seemed to carry a dual purpose: to sustain life and to preserve observation, evidence that the shelter's guardianship had never ended. The tapes themselves reinforced this notion. Some recordings implied that the siblings had anticipated being found, detailing precautions for outsiders who might enter the shelter. Other tapes, particularly the final reels, contained extended silence punctuated by small, deliberate sounds: footsteps, a soft scrape of wood, the faintest shift of fabric that did not belong to any of the known voices. The timing and consistency suggested that these sounds were not coincidental but intentional, as if someone or something was still conducting surveillance, measuring reactions, ensuring that the boundaries set decades earlier remained intact. Even after the reels were moved to secure storage, a sense of presence persisted. Listeners described hearing the subtle hum of recorded voices in moments of quiet, feeling cold drafts that followed them down hallways, and experiencing the uncanny sensation that eyes were tracking them from angles where no one could be. The phenomenon was most acute when tapes were played in sequence, reinforcing the impression that the Boone siblings' environment had not ended with isolation but had extended outward, reaching those who interacted with their recorded world. The conclusion that emerged was unsettling: the shelter, and whatever it contained, had not been abandoned in 1968. Its guardianship had continued in ways impossible to measure or fully comprehend. The Boone siblings' meticulous records, the unseen voice that corrected and guided them, and the anomalous occurrences surrounding the tapes all pointed to one undeniable fact: the mountain had not released its inhabitants, and the watchers within it had not stopped observing. The evidence suggested continuity beyond the physical space of the shelter, an enduring presence that lingered in sound, silence, and memory, leaving anyone who came into contact with it with the uneasy certainty that the Boone shelter was listening still, patiently, and without end.